Baruchim Abayim, and a big warm welcome to all our guests tonight. Before we begin, I would just like to run through with you the order of the evening and give you some technical tips on how to make the best of it. My name is Jay Churara from the Jewish Community Foundation Trust, and I will be your host for this Salford Healthy Communities event tonight. You have noticed that everyone is muted. Please stay muted as the sound is very sensitive on these microphones. If you wish to comment or ask a question, please do so on the chat function. Our speakers, when invited to speak, will need to unmute themselves. You can turn off the camera if you wish, but please put your name on display or your organization's name instead of just someone's iPad. The event itself will be recorded and a public record made available for those who are not with us tonight. Dear audience, we are tremendously privileged to have with us an important guest speaker tonight, Mr. Colin Bland, who will share with us his expertise, insights, and lived experience on gaming addictions and gambling harms. And this will be followed by a Q&A. So I will introduce our guest, who will give a talk. We will have a short Q&A with Mr. Bland, and I will then talk about the psychology of addiction generally, and we will open up to a Q&A with our audience. After that, our chair, Jackie Lewis, will give a vote of thanks, and we aim to finish around 9:30. But before I start, here are a few words by way of introduction for Mr. Bland. Colin is project lead for GamLearn, a charity supporting those who have experienced gambling-related harm and providing opportunities for them to build a better future. He was previously the Northwest Education Manager for YGAM, delivering educational workshops, providing information on gaming and gambling in the UK. Prior to this, he led the Gambling Support Service project for Yorkshire, Humberside, and North Lincolnshire, delivering training to frontline workers via Citizens Advice Calderdale. He is a member of a lived experience group called GamHive, working alongside Greater Manchester Combined Authority. He is experienced in social media. He has also worked on the National Gambling Helpline. And between 2001 and 2018, he was a police officer where he was deployed in numerous roles requiring a vast array of skills to perform. He is highly motivated and deeply passionate about his subject and dedicated to helping others turn negatives into positives. Mr. Bland, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jay. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, guys, for having me tonight. I am honoured to be able to sort of tell my story and to hopefully just to raise awareness for yourselves and anybody else. Quite honestly, anybody that's willing to listen. Just in terms of what my story, my journey, my lived experience of gambling harm, in the hope the hope that by retelling my story and doing the work that I do, it can continue to raise awareness and encourage conversation between yourselves, between friends, between family, loved ones, colleagues, and just to make that conversation that little bit more fluid and a little bit less of a taboo subject, because predominantly if people don't speak to one another about their issues, it makes that problem very, very internalized, and it makes it 10 times harder. The old adage of a problem shared is a problem halved, and so on and so forth. It really is true. And this is why I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you guys tonight about my journey, in the hope that you might be able to take a little bit away from what I tell you, and you might look to other people and just encourage conversation as we move further forward, so you can perhaps help people that might be struggling silently within your friend group, community, family, so on and so forth. I suppose I'll start from the beginning. I don't have a script. Everything that I say, we were talking just prior to the meeting, everything that I say truly does come straight from the heart. It is as authentic as it can be. It can be raw. I mean, I've told my story so many times now. It's not necessarily raw for me, but perhaps sometimes for the listener, it can be quite difficult sometimes. And so, like I say, please, if anybody wants to ask any questions, then by all means, put something in the chat. I'm happy to speak later on. But sort of starting from the beginning, as Jay said, I still consider myself, I'm an ex-police officer, because obviously I was a police officer for nearly 20 years. And probably a good third of that was in Greater Manchester. 2001 to 2008, I was based in Greater Manchester, around Littleborough and Rochdale, and I did work in the city centre and various other roles. And then I transferred to West Yorkshire, where I spent another 10 years, because I'm originally from Bradford. But throughout all that period, and before and then afterwards, quite obviously, I was struggling with a gambling addiction, and that gambling addiction started, believe it or not, I'm 44 in a couple of months' time. My gambling addiction started when I was 13 years old. And I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, but it's only in hindsight that you look back and you go, the behaviors that I was displaying then were that of an addictive, an addicted gambler. And what is particular, this is the first time I'll be able to say this weekend, it feels like a little bit of digression, but this weekend I went to a caravan site with my in-laws, and they've got a caravan up in North Yorkshire. I went up there, and that is the same caravan site that I went to as a child with my parents. So it's a pure coincidence. There's no relation between my in-laws. It was there where my gambling addiction started, and it was the first time yesterday that I was on the same caravan site for the first time in over 30 years, where I can trace my gambling addiction starting back to. And that was in the games room, the games house on this caravan site, where there was the slot machines. And when you think back to that, I was talking about, it's about 1990, 1991, something like that. There was no real safeguarding in place. There was a lot of the things that are in place now that you'd be horrified. It just didn't exist then. So there were arcade machines, there were gambling machines, slot machines, fruit machines in this games room that children could play on. There was no real restrictions to stop children playing on them. And even at that age, I was fascinated. And again, I didn't realize it at the time. It's only when you look back in hindsight. My parents would want to go off for the day. We'd be up at the caravan site, and they'd say, "Come on, let's go off wherever the parents were going to take to." I did not want to go because I wanted to stay in the games room and keep playing these machines. And again, I didn't realize it at the time, but it's only as I got older and you look back that you see just how addicted to those things I were. The flashing lights, the visuals, everything that advertising now is used with, all the auditory stimulation. It was there back in the early 1990s. And as I got older, I was always very independent. Even as a 13-year-old, I was fiercely independent. And again, it was a different time. It was where you'd disappear first thing in the morning and you wouldn't come home until late at night, and your parents wouldn't necessarily worry about you. Now, I've got 3 children, 18, 16 and 15. The idea of them going off first thing in the morning and not coming back till late at night without me knowing where they are is just not something I want to think of. But back then, that's what we used to do. And so when I was sort of 15, 16, 17, I used to go off into Bradford city centre, again, which is where I was from. And I would find myself going into what nowadays would be called an adult gaming centre, which was, again, where the slot machines were. And I was, again, fascinated at just everything about the machines, the noise, even the smell of the environment. All that it was intoxicating, even as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. I do think part of that was because it was supposed to be an adult environment, as in over 18. So when you're 15, 16, you suddenly feel very grown up when you're in these environments, or you feel like you are. It makes you feel older than you are, and you walk with a bit of a strut. But what I was doing at that point then is I was playing these machines over and over again all day, whereas my friends would come and go, I would stay. And I would be there for hours and hours and hours. I left school at 15, but when I got to about 16, 17, I got myself a job. By this time, then I was working at Yorkshire Water, and well, again, I think by then I probably even knew I had a problem at that stage. I used to take time off work. I would take days annual leave, and I would phone in sick sometimes. Not proud to say it, but I would phone in sick. I wasn't sick, but I was wanting to spend my time in these adult gaming centres, playing on the machines all day, every single day. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked in banks or post offices or anywhere where you might handle coins all day, every day. But I used to spend so much time in these gaming places on these fruit machines, holding pound coins in my hand. If you hold pound coins in your hand for so long, the sweat from your hand reacts to the coin, and your hand ends up going green. And my hand, I used to go home daily because I was holding pound coins all day, pumping these slot machines time after time after time. And as soon as I got to my 18th birthday, shortly after that, I went to the bank to get a bank loan because I'd already borrowed, silly amounts of money, to be perfectly honest with you, for an under 18-year-old. And I took a £5,000 loan out at 18 years old. So that will have been in 1996. I took a £5,000 loan out straight after my 18th birthday. And when I get to the end of my story, you'll see where I'm coming from. But it took me until last June, as in June 2021, to finally pay that off. So it took me from 1996 until June 2021 to pay that off. It's a little bit more to it than that, but the reality is, once I took that £5,000 loan out, I was never, ever, until June 2021, out of debt. Because what I did then, my gambling got worse. I gambled more and more and more. As I got older, I started going in betting shops. So I was starting betting on the horses, betting on the football. I'm a massive sports fan. So I would gamble on football. I would gamble on mainly football and horse racing, but literally anything that was on in the betting shop, I would gamble on. And of course, that £5,000, I'd used some of it to clear some of the debts that I'd borrowed from friends and family and so on and so forth. But the rest of it ultimately got frittered away gambling in the betting shops. So of course, that £5,000 loan didn't last very long. But this, going back to the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, banks were falling over themselves to lend money at the time, because obviously you had the difficult time at the beginning of the 90s. Then you had the financial crash in 2008. Unfortunately for me, I was kind of caught in the growth period where the banks were falling over themselves to lend you money. So my £5,000 loan, quickly I went back to the bank and made it a £10,000 loan to clear the £5,000 off and to give myself an extra 5,000. And of course, that got gambled. And that is how the rest of the next 20, 21, 22 years went, taking loan after loan after loan. I spent so much time in the betting shops that, I ended up nearly lost my job as a police officer because I was taking time in my probation. And then I broke my ankle. I was on a night out. I broke my ankle and I had some time off work because of that. And of course, that will have been around about 2001, 2002. And at that point, I was at home with nothing else to do. So, of course, I was off work for 5 months solid. And I spent 5 months solid in the betting shop. And it was around that time. I don't know if any of you have heard of, they're called fixed odd betting terminals, or you might have heard of them as FOBTs or FOBTs. But for those of you that don't know what they are essentially a gambling machine. If you go into a pub or a quiz, if you see a quiz machine type thing, but on this machine is roulette, is blackjack, and is like a digital version of a fruit machine. And up until a few years ago, and this is for those of you that don't know, I mean, this will horrify you, but you could spend, if you think of a roulette machine, a roulette wheel, it spins and it will take approximately 20 to 30 seconds to spin the roulette wheel. And that's what these machines did. You could place a stake of up to £100 per spin, which meant you could stake up to £100 every 20 to 30 seconds. And I did £100 every 20 to 30 seconds. You know, you don't need to be a mathematician to suddenly work out just how quickly the debts can increase beyond belief. 2000, I bought my first house with my then partner, because this is more, you know, the big thing for me is it affects far more than the individual themselves. Of course, it affected me badly, and I will sort of touch upon that as we move forward. But at the time, I had a partner. We bought a brand new house. Going back to the 90s, we bought it for £50,000. I know that sounds ridiculous. Now you can buy a shed for £50,000 these days, but it was a brand new house. 7 years later, we sold it for 125,000. So we'd made £75,000 worth of equity. But I had already taken all that equity out of the house and gambled that over the course of them years. The £5,000 loan that I mentioned that became a 10 quickly became a £25,000 loan with one bank. That bank wouldn't lend me any more, so I went to another bank and took another £25,000 loan out. I was playing these fixed odd betting terminals like you would not believe. Just try, and the problem for me is it was a spiral because I truly couldn't see. I was already in so much debt at this point that the only way that I could see out of it, the only way that I could think of getting out of it, I couldn't save my way out of it. It wasn't a case of, in my eyes, if I just stop gambling and start saving my money, I'll clear my debt. My debt was already in the tens of thousands by this point. There was just no way that I could see myself. I would have still been saving now to clear it. The only way that I could see was to gamble more. And of course, then the stakes get ever bigger, but the losses get ever bigger. And the house always wins eventually. So we played these fixed odd betting terminals for many, many years. Mid 2000s, that's when the iPhone came out, if you remember 2007. And of course, then that's when your apps started, the online gambling world. I had my daughter in 2006. One of the moments that I always remember the worst, just before the iPhone came out, but internet gambling was starting to become a real thing. You used to be able to Sky Bet. You'll have heard of Sky, you know, obviously the TV company, using Sky Bet. On the eve of my daughter's first birthday, she was upstairs. My ex-partner, she became, we'll come on to that, but she was upstairs bathing my daughter the day before her first birthday. I was downstairs using my remote control to spin roulette wheel time after time, and I lost thousands and thousands of pounds. Sat down using my own TV remote control just to play a roulette machine on my TV, and I lost thousands of pounds doing that while my baby girl was upstairs being bathed the day before her first birthday. The apps came on. I'll sort of move along a little bit because if I did my full story, I'd be here until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. But when the iPhone came out, I like to be at the cutting edge of technology. So I've got the iPhone, and of course, then everything moved, you know, online, and the internet gambling thing became so much easier. And I just, of course, started opening accounts with all the ones that you'll have heard of: your Paddy Power, Betfred, Ladbrokes, Sky Bet, and then a million of other ones that you'll have never heard of because the small little independent ones. And I just gambled and gambled and gambled. And then, of course, it went on to things like the online casino. It's your casino in your pocket. You can use the technology advanced so much. I ended up splitting up with my daughter's mum back in 2011. And that was as a result of my gambling. I always say it would be disingenuous of me. People always think of a scenario such as that, and you know, I've had enough of your gambling type thing, and you come home and my bags are packed and they're in a bin liner on the drive. And it wasn't like that. It was far more insidious. It was far more stealth, because the reality was I was a police officer. My partner was working in the police. We were both earning a collective good wage. The reality was we should have had more. Neither myself or my ex are materialistic people. But when you're working hard all day, all week, you kind of want something to show for that. And what I mean is we were driving around in old bangers as cars were falling to pieces, and we were having to find money to repair them. The reality was we shouldn't have been driving because our life, you know, that our wage and salaries and things combined should have afforded us the luxury of not having to scrimp and save. But the reality was I'd gambled all the money away, so we had nothing left. And that then it sort of slid into other aspects of life. As my daughter got older, we needed a bigger house, but we couldn't afford the house that we should have been. We're looking at our friends and colleagues. They're all going off on holidays into lovely places, and they're working in the same industry as us, all earning the same. You all know what each other earns. So it's like, well, why can't you go on holiday? Or why, you know, my ex is saying to me, why can't we go? And eventually it just got too much for her. We didn't have any more children, which we would have done because we couldn't afford it. she ended up, and one of the hardest things when you talk about other people being affected, bearing in mind that I split up from my ex in 2011, it was only last year, so in 2021, 10 years after I separated from my ex, that she was able to get back onto the property ladder, because I was fortunate that I was able to keep the house that we lived in. She ended up moving into rented accommodation, and she could never then afford to get back onto the property ladder. She got back on in 2021. If you take that all the way back on the timeline, in 2000, we bought that house together with a 25-year mortgage. She should now be about 3 years away from being mortgage free. The reality is she is literally only just started. And I have to take so much responsibility for that, because it was the money that I gambled all them years ago. It took her 10 years to get herself back on her feet as a result of some of the things that I did. And then, of course, there's many, many other detrimental effects that it's had when I separated from my ex. I struggled with mental health, and I continued to gamble throughout. It just perpetuated it. So, but when I split up from my ex, I was signed off work with depression. But the reality was I was gambling as well, and it was the gambling that was causing the depression. But my sergeant at work, and bless him, it wasn't his fault. You see a sick note that says depression, and I've just separated from my partner of 13 years as it was. He put 2 and 2 together and went, that's why he's got depression. Didn't ask any further questions. And I don't blame him for not doing so. But the reality was, if he'd have asked, I might have been a little bit more open and gone, look, I'm having real financial problems here as well. Unfortunately, a byproduct of then getting more and more time off work, I was signed off work for 6 months. I'm suddenly at home on my own. I'm not working. I'm depressed. So you can imagine what happened. So my gambling got even worse at that point. Spiraled out of control. I had a massive fallout with my parents. I borrowed money off them to try and clear my debts. Defaulted on the payment back to them because I gambled it all the way again. And Christmas Eve 2011, I took a massive overdose. I drank a ridiculous amount of whiskey and then took a preposterous amount of tablets. When you talk about, maybe it's not your time. I haven't got time to go into the full circumstances now, but how I was found on Christmas morning realistically should never have happened. When you talk about it, clearly wasn't my time, and divine intervention or whatever you might want to call it, the circumstances that led to me being found would not have happened ever before and probably would never happen again. But I was laid there in a hospital bed Christmas Day 2011. By 27th of December, I'm still laid in the hospital bed. I was gambling again on my phone. I was still gambling. I literally couldn't kick the habit. I was laid there in bed, in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of me, but I was on my phone still gambling. And that went on. I came out of hospital and I haven't seen my parents on the 1st of September this year. It'll be 10 years since I've seen my parents. They're both still alive. They only live about 15 miles away. But I haven't seen them. So the fallout from all this, and I take an awful lot of responsibility. I don't blame anybody else in that sense. I also don't necessarily blame myself. This was an addiction. This was an illness. And then when you talk about advertising and things like that, the things that the gambling operators do to, keep you in or lure you in, inducements, incentives, and things like that. So they have a part to play in all of this. But to sort of speed it along, I suppose, I continued gambling all the way through, right up until 2018. Christmas Day 2018 was the day that I literally went, I can't do this anymore. And what had happened was I'd started seeing what is my now partner. We've been together nearly 8 years. But when I met my partner, because I love my sport, suddenly it gave me open rein to gamble openly. When I've previously been with my ex, by the end, I was doing it in secret because I knew I was doing wrong and I knew that she didn't want me doing it. When I got with my new partner, she had no idea of my history. She had no idea of the problems that I'd had for so many years. And that, to me, felt like the green light. It's wrong, but it did feel like the green light. So I'd be watching the football with my phone at the side of me, putting a bet on quite openly with her at the side of me. She had no idea until, of course, the debts continued to mount, and eventually it just came to a crisis point because I was going to casinos and things like that. We were living in separate houses at the time, and a couple of times I remember going and I would phone her at 7 o'clock the following morning, having gone to the casino at 9 o'clock the previous night, and just spent the entire night in the casino, drunk myself sober, because it just goes all through the night. And then doing the walk of shame, 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm walking home in last night's clothes, half drunk, having spent way more money than I could possibly afford, and having to phone my partner in tears. And I did that several times until it became mentally exhausting. And that's what I always say. I got mentally exhausted. I gambled for 27 years, and eventually I left. Like I say, I left the police in 2018, and it was just after leaving the police. I was fortunate that I was able to take voluntary redundancy from the police, and I got a sizable payout, sizable redundancy package, which helped me to clear a chunk of my debts, not all of them, but clear a chunk of my debts, which afforded me the ability to then be able to, because I was on a reasonably good wage in the police, and I was locked in because I had so much debt. I needed that wage to be able to pay those debts. So when I took the voluntary redundancy, I was able to take the money, the redundancy money, and pay a massive chunk of my debts off, which allowed me to then take a job at a much smaller wage because I didn't need it as much to pay the debt. But it gave me much better job satisfaction. I worked in drugs and alcohol recovery for a year, and it was during that time that I got myself into my own recovery. Like I say, Christmas Day 2018, it always sticks in my brain. Christmas Day, we're downstairs with the kids. So this is 4 years ago. So the kids will have been 14, 12, and 11 at that time. Downstairs, opening presents, all like a lovely Christmas morning setting, as you can imagine. The stereotypical one. I went upstairs to brush my teeth. Took my phone upstairs with me. Genuinely only went up to go brush my teeth. £500 later on the blackjack table, in the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth. £500 down. And I had to go back downstairs, and we call it the invisible addiction. I had to go back downstairs, put a smile on, and nobody had a clue that I just continued the day. Inside, I was absolutely dying. I felt the worst I've ever felt because the kids, it's Christmas morning when all's said and done. You're supposed to be having this lovely family time and so on. And I've just done that upstairs, and I felt awful. And it was at that point then I put the self-exclusion thing on, which I'm sure Jay might ask me about in some terms of the things, but I did a self-exclusion predominantly, and I never looked back apart from once. I managed to do that. I self-excluded. I didn't gamble for a year until the following year. Just to quickly finalise, I know I've been talking for a while. I didn't gamble at all for one whole year. Christmas Day 2018, I put the self-exclusion on. Christmas Day 2019, in my head, I thought I've done a year without gambling. Ridiculously, I thought I'm cured. I've cracked it. These ridiculous notions. And I thought I'd just love to have a couple of quid, a couple of quid on the darts. I love my darts. Christmas time is the World Darts Championship. So I tried to open my accounts again, and none of the gambling operators would let me reopen my accounts. And the reason that they wouldn't is they told me that my previous gambling had been too erratic. And that tells you a lot when the gambling operators are telling you that they won't open your account because your gambling had been too erratic. So I waited a few days, sulked, because I thought, well, who are they to tell me I can't do this? But I should have been grateful. I saw an advert on the telly for a particular gambling operator, and I just thought to myself, I thought, do you know what? I don't think I've ever had an account with them, which is rare. I thought I had an account with everybody. So I thought, I'll just try it. Tried opening an account with them, and sure enough, I was able to, because they had no history on me. Brilliant, no problem. Couple of quid on the darts, no problem. Darts finished that night, and I'm sat there with my phone, an active gambling account. And what did I do? Within a couple of hours, then I was straight on the online blackjack table, spent thousands again on my credit card. So it wasn't even my money. It's on my credit card. You can't do that nowadays. They put a credit card ban on gambling. But at that time, this was about 4 months before the credit card ban. And I hated myself, absolutely hated myself, because in my mind, I had erased all the good that I'd done for the previous year, not gambling. Had to tell my partner yet again, breakdown, tears, apologies, I'll never do it again. So at that time, I truly meant it. Put the self-exclusion back on, this time for 5 years. And I've never looked back since. I write on my calendar every single day how many days it is since I last gambled. and I did mean to check before we started this. I can't quite remember what I wrote this morning. I think it's 856 days since that time. And of course, there was 1 year before that. So that's what I say, just in terms of relapse. A lot of people beat themselves up if they relapse, and I did at the time. I don't encourage or recommend relapse, of course I don't, but it was really, it was a positive, in hindsight, was a positive for me, because what it did do is it taught me I cannot gamble. I simply cannot gamble, because I only intended to have a couple of pounds, and within a couple of hours, it became a couple of grand and more. So I'm very, very strict with myself now. So I'm looking forward to September, when I will be able to do the official 1,000 days gamble free. But there is always a year before that. It's kind of like a caveat that I put onto it. And since then, like Jay said at the beginning, my sort of introduction, I've dedicated myself to trying to help other people not go down the path that I did, or if they are on that path, to try and get them onto the path that I am now on, I suppose, and show them that recovery is possible. I'll do anything that I can to help anybody. I'll talk to anybody. I've been on podcasts. Only this weekend, I had a message on Twitter, a direct message from somebody who lives in Perth, Australia. I have no idea who this person is, thanking me for what I did on a podcast. I gave my story on a podcast. He listened to it, and it inspired him. And he said, I'm walking on the beach in Perth, I think it was. He said, listen to it. And you look at that, that gives me so much fulfillment. It gives me so much happiness and satisfaction, that out of the negatives of all the things that I did, because I was terrible. I lied, I cheated, I stole, I did some things that I'm so not proud of. But I now look at where I am now, and I look back, and I really am trying to make amends for that, and do all that I possibly can. And this is why I've come today. It's why I'm grateful to be asked to come and speak to people like yourselves, because it gives me the opportunity to try and give something back. I'd be lying if I didn't say this is quite cathartic for me. I enjoy doing this. I do find it quite cathartic as well. I'll sort of draw lines there, I think, because I will, and that really is a whistle stop tour, because if I was to give the full details, I would be here for an awful long time. But I'm mindful that people might want to ask questions, so I'll give you guys an opportunity. But thank you for listening to me. I hope it's all right for you.
Colin, thank you. That was really an informative and illuminating story, and very meaningful. And thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I'm just going to follow up with one or two questions, before I talk about the psychology of addiction, and we invite the audience to ask questions. As you were sharing with us your really harrowing experience, your ups and downs with this addiction. I wanted to ask, how did you deal with the guilt, the shame, and the stigma that was attached to it? Because I would imagine at some stage it was very difficult, as you said. You couldn't really share this with anyone else involved in your life.
It really was incredibly difficult, because you internalize it, and it goes back to this really is an invisible addiction. And to sort of draw a comparison, when I mentioned about Christmas Day 2018, where I came back downstairs to my family and had to continue as normal. I don't want to be too generalising, but if I had gone upstairs and drank a bottle of wine, or if I'd have gone upstairs and taken some substances, some drugs or something like that, there is a strong possibility that it would have been recognised and it would have been identified by my family, because I would have perhaps looked different, smelt different, sounded different with my speech, all these different things. With gambling, there's nothing, absolutely nothing. It is completely invisible. And that, going back to the shame and the stigma, it really does make it very, very difficult, because how did I deal with it? I didn't deal with it very well, if I'm honest with you, Jay. That is part of the problem, because you when you're in the grip of it, you do feel like there's only you. You feel like it is only yourself. And again, this is part of why I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak, because by doing things like this, I'm hopefully getting across to people that you're not on your own. There are people out there, and over the last sort of few years, there's been some real movement and traction in the lived experience side of things, speaking out addressing these issues so that more and more people don't feel like they're on their own. But I do fully understand why people would feel really sort of stigmatized by it. The stigma that I felt particularly as a police officer, I couldn't speak up. I couldn't speak up and say I'm having a problem with it because the financial implications that would have had. But as a police officer, quite often, depending on what role you are, and certainly in some roles that I was in, you could come across and be handling large amounts of money. Well, if I was to put my hand up and say I'm struggling financially, it's a horrible thing to say, and it's very, very difficult to think of it like this. But the reality is, would that make me vulnerable to suddenly, you pick up a bundle of money? Well, has anybody seen me do that? And so, as a police officer, you'd get pulled away from operations. It might hamper your career. It might inhibit your progression because you want to go into certain roles where there might be cash handling, there might be large amounts of money. But if your superiors know that you're struggling with a gambling addiction and you've got financial problems, are they going to put themselves in a position where they've put you in a position where you could be vulnerable to perhaps taking money? I wouldn't have done it in those sense, but you would forgive them for thinking that. And so that meant that I couldn't speak up about it, or didn't feel like I could speak up about it. I spoke with occupational health under the guise of depression. And this, again, goes back to why I'm so keen to get awareness and raise awareness. I had 4 sessions with my occupational therapist via work. And on the 4th session, I had to tell her that the root of my problem was a gambling addiction because she hadn't even identified it. She'd spoken to me about how much you're drinking. Are you taking any illegal substances? Are you having issues at work? Your family life, of course, I'd split up with my ex and all these different things. Not once did it even flicker on her radar that there might have been a gambling problem. And this is part of the problem, because people will actively go, they will think about drugs, they will think about alcohol, and quite rightly as well. I'm not diminishing that at all. Like I say, I've worked in drug and alcohol recovery, and it's very, very important. But what I would like to see is I'd like people to think drugs, think alcohol, and think gambling as well, and ask those difficult questions. And they are sometimes difficult. They really are. But even GPs don't ask particularly. A lot of people, what I often say is, if somebody turned around to you and said, how many cigarettes do you smoke a week? If you smoked, you'd quite happily tell them. If they say you go to your doctors and how many units of alcohol a week do you drink? That's normalised, and quite rightly so. They will ask you that. Nobody will turn around and go, how much do you spend on gambling? Because people suddenly go, you can't ask them that. Well, for me, I don't really understand why not. These are just questions that need to be asked, because if someone's struggling, if they're not asked the question, the chances are they're not going to actively seek out. However, if you have those conversations with people and show a bit of empathy, and if you have a little bit of information and knowledge as to where you might be able to signpost the people onto for that help, they're more likely to speak up. I'm not saying I would have spoke up, but if somebody had approached me many years earlier, it would have increased my chances of getting into recovery a lot earlier than I did do. But nobody ever asked. It was so silent, it was so invisible, it was so internalized that everything I did was in secret. So nobody had any idea. If anybody had got an idea, then if they'd have asked me, maybe I would have opened up. But living in the day and age that we're in, gambling is so normalized. If your telly was on at any point during the day to day, I guarantee you, if you watch the TV station that had adverts on it, there will have been a gambling advert. No two ways about it. Whether that was for bingo or whether it was for, put a bet on the football or whatever, it's normalized. It is absolutely constant. And I liken that to if I was struggling with heroin addiction, and I'm sat at home and I'm going cold turkey and I'm trying my hardest to stop taking heroin. It's the equivalent of having your drug dealer knock on the door every 15 minutes saying, do you want some drugs? Do you want some drugs? Well, that's what gambling's doing on the television. If you imagine if you're sat there trying not to gamble, and every 10 to 15 minutes there's another advert and another advert, that's not just on your telly either. It's on your phone, it's on the internet, it's on your gaming console, it's on everywhere. It's on billboards, it's on buses. It's an incredibly difficult thing, so we need to raise that awareness for me, and to break down that shame, to break down the stigma, and to encourage people to speak up. That is going to take some time. You know, I'm under no illusions that it's going to take some considerable time, but I would like to think that in 10, 20 years, we might look back on 2022 in the same way that we now look back on the year 2000 around about mental health. Nobody spoke about mental health. Sort of, you know, 20 years ago, it was a taboo subject. Look how much progress we've made now. Look how the advances that we've made now. People are a lot more comfortable in speaking up and speaking out about issues if they're struggling with things, and that's good. And I really do feel that hopefully we'll, in 10, 20 years' time, I might look back on gambling and go, how did we allow this to happen? The advertising and the everything that goes with it. But it's going to take some time. It is.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Colin. We've had some questions already, and I encourage our audience to put questions in the chat and to ask the questions. What I will do as well is I will look at this. We will look at this from a slightly different viewpoint, which is addiction in general and the psychology of addiction, because gambling is one form of addictions, and there are many. So really, when we look at this issue, we know that addiction is a mental illness that leaves people feeling empty and alone. It's feel good now and regret it later behavior that impairs the ability to self-regulate. So here's what we need to know. Here's how to recognize the issues and how to get help. Emotional pain is at the root of most addictions, and so is negative thinking. Addiction is a way to escape self-loathing, as we heard, or some other brand of pain like loneliness, emptiness, boredom, anger, depression, anxiety, you name it. And it almost works, but it doesn't quite. The saying goes, at least when I'm high or engaged in pleasurable activity, i.e. eating something I love, shopping, gambling, etc., I'm happy and I forget all my worries. I'm so focused. Addiction is not a lack of willpower, and it's not a moral failing. It's compulsive, out of control, feel good now, pay for it later behavior that destroys lives, careers, and marriages. The family that lives in constant fear of losing their home thanks to dad's gambling habit, the teenager who put his future at risk because he's unable to see his potential and drops out of yeshiva, the young adult who can't hold on to a teaching position because of his drinking problem. The behavior is baffling because, as we said, it betrays our common sense notion that if it hurts, you don't do it. No one chooses to be powerless over a substance or a behavior that they know is harmful. And the causes of this addiction are complex. It's a mix of genetics, environmental factors, the social influences, and all contribute to this heartbreaking disease or addiction. And it can manifest in many ways: cravings, loss of control, continuing involvement despite adverse consequences. Think about it. But it is possible to recover from addiction, even though it's painful and arduous. However, sadly, despite effective treatment, only about 10% of people ever receive treatment. So people have asked, what are the sources of addiction, causes and consequences? Addiction itself is not recognized as an official diagnosis. An addiction to drugs or alcohol is diagnosed as a substance use disorder. Right now, there's only one behavior that is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association and included in DSM-5, and that is gambling disorder. Some substances that are associated with addiction, there's addiction to alcohol and cigarettes, addiction to drugs, addiction to opioids, such as over-the-counter painkillers, addiction to sugar, carbs, food. With continued use, the brain and the body become dependent on the addictive substance, and the body enters withdrawal, triggering a host of unpleasant symptoms if you try to quit. But even some normal behavior, what we accept as normal behavior can become addictive, such as eating or shopping or using the internet, as we said, overuse of the internet, mobile phones, playing internet videos and games, going on online casinos. Work itself can become addictive, and even exercise. So people have asked, what is the difference between habit forming versus addiction? A habit becomes an addiction only if it is problematic, if it's harmful. People have asked, what are the symptoms of addiction? So cravings is one, the intense desire to go back to the behavior. Now that is a sign that there's an issue there. Compulsion, that is the urge, the strong urge to do something, knowing that that something is harmful. That's a compulsion. And with it comes the lack of self-control. There are social problems as well. Substance use disorders can cause you to fall behind on important tasks at school or at work, in the community or at home. You may deprioritize relationships and vital elements of your life due to preoccupation with the addiction. There's an element of risk-taking, as we've seen as well. People may engage in risky behavior, like driving while under the influence, or stealing to feed the habit. People may continue to use substances despite obvious consequences that arise as a result, like being arrested and losing their driver's license. So when we look at the causes of addictive behavior, the causes can be many. They can be at the level of thinking, this false thinking, this avodah zarah, as it were, believing in idols and miracles and believing in something else, that perhaps the person can beat the machine or can beat the system and win really big. There's the emotional cause as well, the excitement, the pursuit of that excitement, the adrenaline, the dopamine hit, and there's the behavior itself as a habit. And what makes people vulnerable to addiction? The environment they find themselves in, including stress factors, including trauma, and family and friends, and more specifically, some risk factors for addiction include family history at times, but very important, peer pressure, especially in teens and young adults. This can play a huge role in encouraging gaming addiction, drug use, and so on. Addiction at an early age, when the brain is still developing, can influence neural networks and increase the likelihood of addiction through the dopamine reward mechanism. And as we've seen, there's this yet to be discovered role of shame and trauma in addiction. The trauma, whether emotional or physical, is a significant risk factor because it overwhelms the person's capacity to cope, and the effects can last for decades. Shame, stigma, the experience that someone is bad or doing something bad and only they know about it, is very common in addiction. People are that leaves people vulnerable to feeling bad about themselves. Unfortunately, shame only perpetuates addiction because victims don't feel they deserve to recover. In a weird way, shame can drive people to continue the addiction, to punish themselves somehow. About treatment and looking ahead, there is hope. I've recently seen an executive leader who hit rock bottom only to go on and save his career and family and start treatment for his addiction through our confidential referral program. But as we said, only 10% of people will seek treatment. So what other options are there? Well, there's medication, there's therapy, there are support groups. There is something that we always talk about in these forums, and that is relaxation, exercise, and diet. Finding a substitute for the addiction. So if your boredom sets in and you make a mistake at work, instead of having a flutter to deal with the anxiety, you investigate the anxiety rather than run from it with a bet or a drink. Learn to meditate, relax, or take a walk and make it a habit in nature. Healing from addictions requires the development of psychological skills, craving management skills, but most of all, habit management skills and measurement. We do a lot of that in the work that we do with the foundation, in conjunction with Salford Healthy Communities, and we will do more. We will involve schools and communal organizations, and through surveys and educational materials to raise awareness of our activities and of this particular issue in conjunction with Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Jewish Telegraph, who are helping us in this regard. Now, I will stop there and I will open it up to our audience for any questions, either to myself or to Colin, or general questions on this topic. I can see Carl. Carl, would you like to go ahead? You need to unmute yourself, Carl.
I was fascinated, Colin, listening to your story. With the work I do, working in the areas that I work in to do with poverty, I come across a lot of gambling and a lot of addiction. And I've actually wrote courses which I teach people, which have, we've had quite a few testimonials. But what was really fascinating to me about your story is the amount of years you gambled. And normally gambling is driven by that desire to win. There's always chasing that pot of gold. Yet here are you, 27 years of it. And yet you must have lost that feeling, that emotion of the winning, and yet you just carried on and on and on. I just find it absolutely fascinating that you went for so long, without really somebody jumping on it.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think I was in the unfortunate circumstance of the age that I was and the time that I was the age that I was. And what I mean by that is early 90s, when I first started gambling on the slot machines. If you think about that, the early 90s, in the mid 90s, you had Euro 96. I'm a big football fan. So there's a big driver around the football side of things. And that's when I was going into betting shops. And so you had that. So I was gambling on the football more and more because there's a real buoyancy, England getting to the semi-finals and all that kind of thing in Euro 96. So there was a real, let's have a bet on the football. So that kept it going. As you move a little bit further then towards sort of the noughties, early 2000, that's when the internet was, really starting to pick up, not take off completely, but it was starting to come around. And you had these fixed odd betting terminals that suddenly came into betting shops.
Yeah,
well, that was in my early 20s. So it was the perfect storm. By that point, then obviously I was already heavily addicted, but I was heavily in debt as well. And so a lot of the time, when I speak about my gambling in that sense, the actual act of gambling, I hated. But it's so difficult to explain sometimes. But what I often say, the exhilaration, the dopamine release almost was in the anticipation of the gambling. The second I started gambling, I wanted nothing more to do with it. But by the second I'd started it, I had already put money in, whether that was physically or digitally online. Because then,
your mindset from the minute you woke up to the minute you went to bed was nothing but thinking about gambling and how you could get more money to do it.
Exactly that. And it was, and then in between as well, I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and instantly roll over to my phone to check my bets on things that I had no knowledge of whatsoever. I would be betting on Chinese second division football at 3 o'clock in the morning. What do I know about that? You know, but it was something to bet on. And it did go on for such a long time because, as I say, then they fixed on betting terminals, and then I was addicted to them. So I suddenly became addicted to roulette. That was my first one. I played roulette for a very, very long time before I moved to blackjack. But then once you can suddenly start to do it on your phone, on your iPad, you know, the years of technological advances, you look back at the Gambling Act of 2005, which is now under review. That was not designed for the technology that we had only a couple of years after that act came into power. And the talk about that being the analog act trying to keep up with the digital era. And this is the problem. And I lived through that, my formative years, and then my early adulthood, where I was starting to earn decent money and I had more money. And it was the perfect storm. It perhaps wouldn't have happened to me 20 years earlier, and it maybe wouldn't have happened 20 years ahead. But unfortunately for me, and that's not a woe is me story. It's just facts. It's just what happened.
I think you've been very brave, Colin, to come out of where you are today after being so brainwashed. The only consolation, if there is anything consolation, that currently in the UK there's over 2 million students suffering with this addiction, and that's just gambling addiction. And I think we were told at one lecture we did, there was about 2.7% of the UK population have got gambling addiction. So the act you're talking about and the changes that need to occur are very, very important if we're to get on top of this thing.
Agreed.
But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been very interesting.
You're more than welcome, Carl. Genuinely,
Thank you.
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Stop anybody else asking a question.
Yes, I'm sure there are people who want to come in. I can see a hand up there. Nathan, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Hi there. First and foremost, I just want to say thanks, Colin. It was fascinating and harrowing, as Jay said, actually, like an incredible tale. I've got a couple of questions, one of which is specifically for you, Colin, then one sort of for both of you. And the first one's just for you, Colin. Do you think that then that gambling is fundamentally a bad thing, or is it something that, you know, people can enjoy in moderation? Obviously, you know, the adverse, as you mentioned yourself, it says, and I'm well aware of myself as a keen sportsman just like yourself, you know, when the fun stops, stop. And I know that phrase very well. And even something that it did personally affect me as well. I was never really into it, but you know, every now and then you point when you're not actually enjoying it. So like, what am I doing this for? But yeah, is it something that you know, you can do in moderation in the same way that you can do sort of anything in moderation? And then the other question is anyone vulnerable to addiction, or is there a genetic makeup that makes people predisposed to addiction? I think, Jay, you mentioned something about there's a medication. Do you mean for addiction, or do you mean for, you know, depression and the other factors? But yeah, so that's quite a few questions there. But thanks.
I'll let Colin go for the first question, and I'll answer the second one. Yes.
Thank you, Nathan. I think so. The short answer to your question is: do I think people can gamble in moderation? Yes, absolutely. I have no desire or will for gambling to be banned outright, none whatsoever. It is things that thousands and thousands of people up and down the country do recreationally for fun, and they do it safely and in moderation. So I have no problem with people gambling at all. I don't want to be a killjoy. I'm not here to stop anybody having fun. Absolutely not. But what I am against is harmful gambling. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm trying to hopefully create a safer gambling environment. And by that links back into what I was just mentioning with Carl about the Gambling Act review and things like that. There's too much responsibility, and has been for a long, long time, placed upon the individual themselves. So the gambler, the responsibility is always on the gambler, as opposed to the responsibility on the operator to try and take more care. So, for example, when I had my relapse and I spent thousands and thousands of pounds in one go with an operator that knew nothing about me, nobody contacted me. Nobody said, well, hang on a minute, can you afford to spend these thousands and thousands of pounds that 2 hours earlier they'd never even heard of Colin Bland, and yet here he is spending thousands and thousands of pounds online. So things like that need tightening up. The regulations and the safeguarding and the care from the operator needs to be tightened up in order to make it a safer landscape. And that's all I'm interested in. In a meeting that I was in earlier on, if you use it as there's nowhere else. If you went into a pub and you were absolutely blind drunk, the landlord, if they were responsible, would probably say, "I'm not going to serve you again." Gambling isn't like that. Gambling, you can gamble and gamble and gamble until you've got nothing left, and nobody particularly stops you. And that's why there's a lot of argument and to-ing and fro-ing about the Gambling Act review, about offering for people having to give affordability checks, and what should there be a soft cap before, where you can gamble up to £100 a month, for example, is one figure that's been bandied around there. But if you want to gamble more than £100 a month, you've got to show that your finances can back that up to stop people doing what I did and gambling recklessly with money that I didn't have. It's a bit of a contentious issue, but in short answer to your question, can people gamble in moderation? Yeah. I've got so many friends that gamble, and they gamble safely. They'll have a football accumulator on a Saturday, and they might have a couple of quid during the week, and they'll take it or leave it. Unfortunately, that wasn't me. That's how it was for me.
Thank you, Colin. I will take the second question, which is really a very good question. In that we look at this as a behaviour in terms of the behaviour itself and the personality that will go with it, and there is no such thing as bad personality or bad behaviour in and of itself. What there is spectrum, and there is a locus of control. So there are some genetic predispositions that are already there, because you will tend to find, research has found that one person displays addictive behaviors and addictive personalities in one area, there will be displaying addictive behaviors in another. There are documented conditions where the person has obsessions. They call them OCDs, obsessive compulsive disorders, where there's excessive washing and so on. So that could be looked at as an addictive behavior in that sense, or being addicted to wanting to win and that excitement that comes from. But the difficulty, rituals in and of themselves are not bad, but it's when they become problematic. It's when it stops the person from sitting down at meals or doing their homework or learning or earning a living, then it's no longer acceptable. If they are self-aware, if they are conscious that they've crossed the line and they can pull themselves back, then that's fine, as we're saying, in moderation. If it goes above that and it becomes, okay, the self-talk goes, well, I can't handle this, but I feel compelled, I feel pushed to carry on with it, then that is problematic. In terms of is there medication? Medication will come under the label of sedatives and tranquilizers to calm down the nervous system and the excitement, but they will not deal with the underlying issue. The underlying issue is very much, as we said, sort of looking at the spectrum and measuring the habit, measuring the time spent on that particular behavior. There's nothing wrong with going for a walk or exercising. It becomes a problem when it's excessive, when it crosses a threshold. There's nothing wrong with drawing lots. That's perfectly normal. It's a game of chance. Probabilities, and people would like to do calculations. When it's fun, there's nothing. But when people are going upstairs into their bedrooms and not telling anyone what they're up to, and they need more resources and so on and so forth, that becomes problematic. So really, that's why we were saying If there is an issue, to call it out straight away from the beginning. If to speak to a friend or to speak to a parent and say, look, this is where I am. I just feel a little bit, and then together, that can be addressed. But in of itself, the behavior, there is, the behavior is fine. It's how the person perceives it and how much control can the person exercise over it. I hope that that has answered, started to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I might, can I just interject? I was just going to mention just very quickly on that second question, just a couple of different points in that. Medication wise, if you look at, like I say, I've worked in drug and alcohol recovery as well. There is medication out there, for example, methadone for a heroin addiction and things like that to help. And the reason why I raise that is because drugs, alcohol are physically ingested substances that you take into the body, and your body will at some point say, I can't physically take any more. You will only be able to, you might be able to have a really good drinking session but eventually your body will go, I can't take anymore. Gambling, there's nothing there. Gambling will strip you of everything, not if you allow it, but it can and will. And there's no medication out there to be able to stop you gambling or to at least assist you with the withdrawals. For example, like I said, the heroin and methadone. Methadone's there to help appease the withdrawals. Gambling is entirely mental, and there is nothing. You can get antidepressants. I still take antidepressants. I'm really open about that. I remember being particularly embarrassed when I first started taking them, and it's only when you start talking to people you'd be amazed at just how many people turn around and go, oh yeah, I do too, or yeah, so my mum does, or my dad does, or my brother does. Why it's been a taboo, I don't know, but it has. But once you start talking, I use the same thing with gambling. Like Jay said there, you'll start to pull away from other people. If you start to do the gambling in secret, that's when it's becoming a problem, because subconsciously you're acknowledging that it's a problem by the fact that you're doing it secretively, because you know that if you got called out on it, that you're perhaps doing something that you shouldn't, or you're doing more of it than you should be doing. And that makes it inherently difficult to identify, because if you're doing something in secret, of course, people can't see you doing it. And that's why it's really, really important that these conversations are had openly, not even just in offering people to say, come and speak if you want to, but basically have these conversations in the open so that people don't feel like they can't speak up about it and they can approach you. It's a very, very difficult conundrum to get to the bottom of, to be honest with you, because it is so invisible. So we're wanting people to reach out, and we're wanting people such as yourselves to have these conversations with people that you think might be experiencing problems. But how do you identify the problems when that person that is having problems is hiding away to have that problem? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then just very, very quickly, you mentioned about, does it affect anybody, any different types? Of course, it can affect different people in different ways. But 27 years worth of gambling for me. There's a lady that I work with. She didn't even start gambling until her mid-50s, and within 3 years, she'd lost her entire wealth.
Wow.
And she didn't even start until she was 55. She did that. You look back at it and you try and identify what happened. That was her coping strategy for a bereavement. She was struggling with grief and that. But the reality is, it can affect absolutely anybody. There's no stereotypical gambler as such. No matter what people might think, there really isn't. It can affect absolutely everybody. And I know so many people from such an array of different diverse backgrounds in every manner that it's touched. So it really can affect anybody.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Looking around the room, we have Tanya. Tanya, please go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Trouble with the computer. Sorry, Jay.
That's okay.
Take over our lives. We can't live with them. We can't live without them. A couple of things. Colin, well, I'm sorry I missed the very beginning. I said the trouble with the computer getting on Zoom. Really fascinating. And your courage is to be applauded, and the work you're doing is similarly to be applauded. And I wish you great strength in continuing with such wonderful work. I could identify, not as a gambler, I may add, but I could identify with a lot of what you were saying, because I was a probation officer for 34 years. So you can imagine I came across quite a number of gamblers, but primarily young adults. And it was before the internet, really, because I'm retired for a few years. And that it was on the, the machines, the slot machines primarily, affecting, schoolwork and family relationships. Had to go into family conjoint family therapy with them, and it was a mess. And of course, it only come to my attention when the consequences of their behaviour are manifested in some for offending behaviour to perpetuate their addiction. There was no such thing as talking about medication at the time. But what was interesting, what you talked about, and I don't think when they had it at the time, is self-exclusion you mentioned. I was interested in that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, because, for seeing you've been a gambler for 27 years, which, if you can, ups and downs like Jay referred to, you can sustain an addiction for as long as that. And you can go through periods of, I'm going to work with it, and I'm going to manage it, or I'm going to, sort of end it, whatever. You go through these sorts of periods with it. Mm-hmm. But the point is, the self-exclusion, was there anything else that you were, or was it just a realization that your life was going nowhere and you were just, it was happening again, losing a partner, losing a house, children, etc., all the impact it had on your life? Beside the self-exclusion, did you have any other means of getting out of gambling?
Yeah, I did. And this is why I often say that, I'm an expert in my recovery. I'm not an expert in recovery. There's a real clear distinction. My advice, what I did, because it was for such a long period of time, self-exclusion only came in, certainly on terms of GamStop, which is an overarching, it self-excludes from all UK licensed gambling operators that hold a UK license. You can go onto GamStop, put your details in, self-exclude for 6 months, 12 months, or 5 years, and you simply can't get onto any of the UK licensed sites. But unfortunately, that didn't come into effect until 2017, which explains why my gambling ran right up until 2018. Had it have been in a lot earlier, I suspect, who knows, but it might have taken a few years off my addiction. Prior to that, you could self-exclude on individual websites. So you could self-exclude from Sky Bet, for example, but which I did many, many times. But then you just go on Ladbrokes, and then you self-exclude on Ladbrokes, and you go to William Hill, and so on and so forth. And so you go round and round in circles. So that's why the difficulty with that side of things. I went to Gamblers Anonymous meeting, so I did do that. Yeah. I had counselling on more than one occasion. I know you guys are obviously sort of Greater Manchester region. I'm just the other side of the border. I'm in Hebden Bridge, so I'm just West Yorkshire border. So I had counselling in Leeds via Necker. But again, and I tried all sorts, if truth be told, Tanya. I tried any different number of mechanisms, support, online forums, and speaking to people, and ringing the National Gambling Helpline, for example, all these different things. For me, it was an accumulation of all the different things that I tried, combined with the absolute exhaustion, as I mentioned earlier on, the mental exhaustion, that it just reached a point where, and if truth be told, and this is something that I often look back on now, it's a horrible thing to say because it affected so many people in such a horrible, negative way. But personally, the COVID lockdowns massively helped me in the sense that I was already on GamStop, so I couldn't gamble online. And of course, during lockdowns, the casinos and the betting shops and everything was closed. So, and equally then I was already starting to work in this space. So you put all that together in the positive sense. I couldn't gamble even if I wanted to do. I was gaining real traction and, dare I say, reputation within the online community of lived experience and the work that I've been doing. That adds in an additional layer of fear of hypocrisy, if truth be told. You kind of, you imagine getting caught coming out of a betting shop, having, just spoken to you guys, for example. That's an additional layer of security. But I tried many, many different things. There's lots and lots of different organizations out there. Some will work, some won't. For each individual, it's a case of finding what works for you. Gamblers Anonymous didn't particularly do a great deal for me, but equally, I know some people that absolutely swear by it, and they've been going for 40 odd years and will not miss a meeting. It really is a case of try everything twice, because it might not hit you at that time. You might go on a different day to Gamblers Anonymous. And when I worked on the National Gambling Helpline, people would often ring up and go, "I've been to Gamblers Anonymous, it didn't work." That's sometimes depends on your current mindset, state of mind, the group that are there at that time. You go a second time and it might be absolutely enlightening for you. But there's so much out there. It just needs to be explored, and just try everything twice. That's what I say. Because it was an accumulation of everything for me, all put together, that helped get me to where I am right now, I think, without being complete.
Oh, that's great. And what about your family? Do they have any support now it's out in the open? Like gammon on, or for the families. Do they go to anything like that?
You've got Gammon On, you've got GamFam, two really, really great organisations for affected others, as they're called. The truth is, like I said earlier on, I don't see my mum and dad anymore. I was from a very small family anyway, so I've lost my relationship with my parents. I'm not saying it can't be rebuilt, but that's a separate issue. So I don't see my parents. I do see my brother quite a lot, but ironically, my brother enjoys a gamble, and we often have some real open discussions, because it comes back to the question that I think it was Nathan that asked earlier on. What do I think about can other people gamble in moderation? The reality is yes. And I had a conversation with my brother only a few weeks ago. We went to the darts together and went to the pub beforehand. I sent a letter to my MP asking for support around the gambling review, about a soft cap, about affordability checks. My brother sent a letter to his MP saying, "I don't want this intrusion on my financial." So these are the polar opposites.
Yeah. You've got problems because they want the money. The operators want the money. Absolutely. And the advertisers want the money. Exactly. So whichever way you look at it, it's a battle.
It really is. A battle. And I don't want to stop anyone's fun. Which, like I say, using my own brother as a perfect example, he sees things very differently to me, and that's fine. As long as it's in moderation and he's in control of it. I wasn't. Mine was out of control, and it caused a lot of hardship. And I'm very, very fortunate to be where I am. Very, very fortunate. I appreciate everything that I've got, and particularly my partner. People always said to me, if you could, what advice? In the ideal world, if I could clone my partner and give my partner to everybody, because she's been absolutely my rock throughout all this lot.
Well, long may you continue to be a rock for each other. Jay, can I just ask you something?
You can.
Yeah, something that concerns me, that I see more and more, and I see younger and younger children, and you were talking about, sort of if it's sort of pre-disorder at a young age, and how it can manifest. It could manifest itself in maybe a addictive disorder, later on in years. Young adults say, but younger and younger children are using tablets and know their way around the tablets very, very easily. And it does concern me the amount of screen time very young children are almost babies. I'm not kidding you either. Are having and are being allowed, and how skilled they are around these tablets. It's phenomenal, and I worry about, how it can become an addictive disorder at in their younger years. And I'm not talking
Indeed.
about, their young adulthood. I mean, about teenage, and that's going to carry on. I mean, look at Colin. Obviously, it's not in the same way, but it could develop, from one type of, looking at a tablet or looking at an iPhone, you know what I mean, onto another format, which, goes with their cognitive behavior in terms of what seems attractive to them at that particular age. Is
Yes.
that to be concerned about or not?
Indeed. That's a very, very important question. And I do get asked that question quite a lot. I mean, someone said to me the other day that, look, the big guys, the big IT guys, the creators in the States and everywhere else, they've got a rule. They don't go on, they don't use mobiles themselves, and they don't encourage their children to use mobiles. And these are the guys that have invented the IT and everything else. So that's a lesson in itself. But we don't live in that world, and we're mere mortals, so we do use them. And we see that, generally speaking, children do use mobiles, and it's good. It's good for their development because they're really good at it. They can learn very quickly and so on. That's fine. And some go on to learn coding and solve problems and become faster and faster at what they do. Now the difficulty is when it becomes problematic, when they start missing meal times, not interacting with their peers, missing out on conversations, missing out on communication, and so on. So those signs can be picked up by anyone around them, and what we do say for any behavior, to begin changing that behavior, first of all, is to become aware of it. And if it's problematic, then to start to just keep an eye on it, to measure it. I mean, there are only so many hours in the day, and how much time is the person, and it could be a child, it could be an older person. How much time is the person spending on the particular device? Are they spending 8 hours more, and so on? And in that case, then it becomes a question of, okay, between the hours of 6 until the hours of 8, no going on the device. And that's all it is. If that's too difficult, just simply 10 minutes away from the machine. And that's all it takes. And that 10 minutes becomes 10 minutes for something else. And over time, that behavior is diminished until such a time as the person is able then to go on both on the machine and off it, because it is needed. It's the world we live in. It is needed for interactions and for everything else. And we know that in the future there will be metaverse and so on. So people will be more immersed in these devices. So really, it's just finding that right balance between the two, between the face-to-face, which is really important, being with other people, communicating, doing the normal things that a person does during their waking hours, and dividing the time between study, play, which is really important, and just time for boredom, for daydreaming, away from everything else. And that is more or less what everyone is aiming for. But yes, I mean, there are stories of children sort of using the tablets to an extent, because sometimes it's convenient. Well, just leave the child with the tablet, and the child will be quiet for a while. But it does need a way out. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I'm aware of the time. We could be. This is a really fascinating topic, and I think we need at least another 2 hours to cover this topic, which would be really good for us. However, we are pressed for time, and so now we will come to the part where Dr. Jackie Lewis will do her concluding remarks and give a vote of thanks before we do a quick feedback for tonight's session. Dr. Jackie Lewis.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you so much for all your efforts to get tonight off the ground. And that you've wanted us to have an event, and this is the beginning of a project to try and raise awareness. So thank you so much. And I wanted to very much thank Colin for your very frank discussion tonight, for raising awareness of all the harms of gambling and gaming. Just listening to you tonight, firstly, when you said that you started at age 13, I was shocked. I was shocked that it began that young. And I think people look at slot machines and they just see something harmless, and the thought that a child could be there spending hours and hours and not wanting to leave the room is really worrying. And the whole story was like an emotional roller coaster. Each time you lost more and more money, you could feel it with you, what you went through, and it must have been absolutely terrible. So I'm sure we're all really glad that you've been able to put your gambling behind you and now put these bad things to good and to help others, and that by helping other people and by raising awareness, you've actually helped to keep yourself clean, because, as you say, you can't be seen now to come out of a gambling shop, because that would be the worst thing now that you're known to be someone who helps others. So it's just the most wonderful conclusion, and that you've got your partner helping you, that's clearly essential too. So thank you so much, Colin, for everything you're doing on this important topic. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. But I'm going to pass back to Jay just for the final, for feedback on tonight.
Thank you, Jackie. As is our tradition, we do a quick feedback at the end. Again, 3 quick questions. The first one is, were you satisfied with tonight's event? And if you were, simply wave or nod. And yes, thank you. I can see the majority there agreeing. The second question is, were your questions answered? Again, either nod or shake it. Thank you very much for that. And finally, would you like to see more of these events by us in the future? Either nod or shake your hand. Again, an overwhelming majority. Thank you very much for tonight, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jay.
Bye.
Thank you. Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.